My name is Andrew Patrick Nelson. I'm the Chief Curator here at Western Spirit, and it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the museum this evening for what should be an informative and really, I guess, enlivening conversation. One of a number of programs that we're fortunate to bring you tied into our exhibit, which I'll say more about in a second. We've assembled a real all-star panel for you this evening, so I think we're all going to learn something about important mid-century artists. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists here in turn, and I'll ask them some questions, and then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for you to ask any questions that you might have. And then when all of that's over, we'll invite you to join us out in the lobby for refreshments and to ask that question you were too embarrassed to ask in front of everyone. It's okay, we all have them. So let's begin by introducing our panel. Betsy Fahlman, there she is Professor Emerita of Art History at Arizona State University and former Curator of American Art at the Phoenix Art Museum. An authority on the art history of Arizona and the American Southwest, with particular interests in public art, American modernism, the New Deal era, and industrial archaeology. Betsy is the author of numerous books and essays, as well as the curator of many major museum exhibitions. She serves on the Board of Trustees here at Western Spirit and has been instrumental in helping the museum acquire several major collections, including the Fran and Edward Elliott Collection of Women Artists in the Southwest. Mark Bahti is a second-generation writer, researcher, art appraiser, gallerist, and the proprietor of Bahti Indian Arts, which has locations in Santa Fe and Tucson. He is the author of several books about American Indian art, including Collecting Southwest Native American Jewelry, Southwest Indian Jewelry, and Spirit in the Stone. He's also a longtime board member of the Tucson Indian Center and chair of the Institute of American Indian Arts Foundation in Santa Fe. Also serves on the board of the Amarin Foundation and the board of the Southwest Association of Indian Affairs, which runs the famed Santa Fe Indian Market. And finally, Lane Hedlund is a cultural anthropologist, writer, curator, and public intellectual. She is Professor Emerita of Anthropology at the University of Arizona and Curator Emerita of Ethnology at Arizona State Museum. She devoted most of her career to collaborating with indigenous weavers and other visual artists, writing books like Navajo Weaving in the late 20th century and Gloria F. Ross in Modern Tapestry. More recently, she's been consumed, fair to say, with an equally important and personal project, preserving the legacy of Mac Schweitzer. She is author of Mac Schweitzer, a Southwest Maverick and Her Art, published earlier this year by the University of Arizona Press, and is curator of Mac Schweitzer, a Southwest Maverick Rediscovered, now on exhibit here at Western Spirit. Please join me in welcoming our three panelists. So Anne, I will direct the first question to you. In the exhibition, you describe Mac Schweitzer as, quote, the mother-in-law I never knew. I'm sure many people understand what that means, having either read the book, seen the exhibition, or both, but I wonder if you would maybe just sketch for us what Mac Schweitzer means to you, who she is to you, so folks can hear it from you.
Yeah. So as this is on, I believe it's on. Oh, good. Yeah, give me a signal if I fade out. I began my career as a cultural anthropologist working with Navajo weavers. I worked some in Mexico, I worked some with Hopi weavers, many of my grad students worked with other artists around the world, but what I was doing was being an anthropologist focused on the act of creativity in different cultural settings. So that's what I did for many, many years of teaching at ASU first, and then teaching at U of A, and working at the Arizona State Museum, consulting with many other museums. In that process, in 1977, I was in Tucson working on an NEA grant at the Arizona State Museum, and I met a man that changed my life. And that was my future husband, Kit Schweitzer. So Kit and I met in 1977. We courted for 5 years, married in 1982. For the next 30 years, our life was one of me being in the field, me teaching, and Kit being a professional sculptor with work in galleries throughout the Southwest. Mark will have something to say about that a little later as well, I think. So our home had many paintings by Kit's mother. And I lived with her art for those years and enjoyed it thoroughly. And many of our friends enjoyed Kit's stories about growing up with Mac, being in Navajo country, traveling and visiting Hopi families, going to Indian ceremonies with Mark's family. But I never thought that I would be writing a book about her. Kit and I both agreed that was for someone else to do some other time. That was not my work, and it wasn't something he wanted to do. He never wanted to become a famous artist himself. He was happy and very satisfied making things and selling and showing and sharing, but he never needed a big audience for that, and he just didn't feel that way about his mother either. I'm going on a little long. I've never told this story this way from the front end. So, Mac was the mother-in-law I never met. We married 20 years after she was gone. She died in 1962. She was no longer around, but I had all of this artwork around. At some point in 2018, Kit and I found a box, a metal box of slides that Mac herself had taken in the 1950s of her artwork. And the blessing there was that she also took the time to, for many of them, hand label their titles, their size, their medium, and even sometimes where she sold them. She had not kept a catalog otherwise. And so here she was doing this. Here we were discovering it. All of a sudden, for the first time, knowing some of the titles of the pieces that we were living with, understanding other things about them. We got those digitally scanned and began to think we could do just a simple book. And we started talking to Mark about that. Yeah, just a simple book, you know, photos and captions. We could just do this. Well, that was 2018, and we got a start on it. And Kit very unexpectedly died. He was 74 at the time. None of us had seen it coming. I had done some tape recordings of his storytelling already, but I let it aside for a year or two. I inventoried the family collections, but I couldn't do anything with it for a while. And then when I went back, I began to realize just how much of a record Mac left with us. How many scrapbooks, photo albums, other kinds of archival material. And at that point, I also you know, a decade earlier it wouldn't have been possible, but newspapers.com provided all kinds of information I hadn't known about. So that began me on the research, but that's the beginning of it all.
Okay. I'll try to pick that story up a little bit. Question for you, Mark. So your father, Tom, is not only a widely known Indian arts dealer, but also a staunch advocate for indigenous causes. Your family grew up camping, visiting Indian artists, attending Navajo and Hopi ceremonials, sometimes with Mac Schweitzer and her son Kit. Right. So I was wondering if you could maybe share some recollections about either those trips or maybe just comment on your family's long relationship with the Schweitzer family.
Well, our past, oh, excuse me. Find the right button here.
Okay. No. You know, our paths crossed a lot because both families were back and forth across the Navajo Reservation and at Hopi and the ceremonies. I remember camping out with them and Charles and Ollie Lola on the Red Rock above Gallup Ceremonial. And it was great because there were still Navajos, you know, showing up in wagons, horse-drawn wagons on it. Fires going and food going and kids running around, and it was, you know, I think I could speak for Kit too. We just had no idea how wondrous all of that was, how lucky we were to experience it. But, and you know, frequently visiting his back when she lived here in town and when they lived up on Tomahawk Hill. But Dad was also an artist. And he did it because he enjoyed it so much. Occasionally he would enter things in competitions, but that brought him in contact with a lot of other artists. Tucson in the mid-century era, the 50s, the early 60s, just an amazing number of amazing, talented artists. Charles Clement, Gene McCabe, Voorhees, Harrison Moore, Bert Wright, and probably a dozen other names that aren't coming to me right away. So, combination of interest in the peoples of the Southwest itself, and art, we were constantly in contact.
Betsy, so right now you are, maybe consumed is too strong a word, but dedicated to a project that looks at the history of women artists here in the Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you might give us a little bit of historical context. Where does Mac Schweitzer fit in to the history of women artists here in the American Southwest, or maybe Arizona more specifically?
Good. I don't, how do I say this? I don't know that much about her. I have worked on a lot of earlier artists that are, and I'm not sure how others accessed her. But she was in Tucson.
Are you hearing her?
Oh, are you hearing me? Yes. Okay, that. So that may be not a good thing, I mean a good thing. I don't think she knew any of them. You mentioned that it might be Mary Russell Farrell Colton. She had Alzheimer's by the time, and so I think all of the earlier women that were there.
Betsy, put the mic up to you.
Oh, of all the earlier women that are there, probably not there. But let me read a couple of things to you. The Arizona art community in the first half of the 20th century comprised women who were widely dispersed geographically. Men were a minority in this. And for these early artists who moved in Arizona for the first several decades of the 20th century, the cultural landscape must have seemed at first as bleak and hot, dusty expanses that they encountered. Of necessity, they were optimistic there. We lacked everything. The support systems necessary for artists to thrive, exhibitions, museums, individual collectors, etc., did not exist in that. So that was sort of the beginning of that. And I'd also like to read another thing that will probably happen. What happened to Arizona's early women artists? And I suppose some of that is a Mac thing too. Their fate is similar to many regional artists within the state. By the time they died, their very best years have long been over. They had also, men were there. They did everything. The dealers, the collectors, the curators, the critics, the scholars, and museums, all were male, and there really was no room for the other women. They showed their work, they were happy to do that, but it was a different animal for them.
So what you're describing, it seems like there's a kind of constellation of women artists throughout the history of the Southwest.
Right.
But it's up to sort of individuals like we have up here to make the connections between them and to create something
Exactly.
larger. All right. Well, I mean, maybe that leads to a good question for Anne. With Mac Schweitzer specifically, why is it that from 1962 until this year, 2025, we more or less forgot about Mac Schweitzer? I mean, how do we go from a place where she's almost ubiquitous here in Arizona, public art, winning shows, to almost overnight being forgotten until very recently? Explain that.
You know, when I started doing the research, I had no idea how popular and how ambitious Mac was in her career to start with. As I looked into the 50s, I discovered just what Andrew is saying. She was in shows, she was everywhere. She was gender blind. She did not associate with other women's groups or attempt to form any groups. but she was marketing her work herself. She was integrated into the Tucson Arts Colony that Mark has been talking about. She was up here in Scottsdale with Charles Loloma and Lloyd Kivanew at the Craftsman Center. She just forged ahead. She was a mind-blowing Energizer bunny, I guess we say now. So when she died in 1962, 3 things happened. One, she was no longer creating new work. She was no longer producing work, and she wasn't there herself to assist in maintaining her memory. That's sort of backwards, but that's the way it happened. Secondly, she'd done such a good job in her career of selling work. She was never wealthy. She did not inherit money. She did not rely on husband's money. She relied on the sales and her teaching and various fees she got as an artist. And so she did a very good job of selling her work. At the time she died, most of her work was already in private or public collections. A few museum collections, but mostly private collections, and in the family's private collection. So there was no work on the market. And then the third thing was that gallerists no longer could promote her work because it wasn't fresh, it wasn't out there in the world. So, and there was no one in the family to carry on and promote. I suspect this is not actually uncommon for many, many artists, or we'd be swamped in artists every day of our lives in the 20th century.
What a nice idea.
Yeah, art has its heyday, and each artist has their heyday, and then they disappear for a time. But in Mac's case, those 3 things really did collaborate to suppress her legacy when it had been so rich and full. And 60 years went by before we began realizing what Mac now represents to Western art and what she has to bring to today's canon in Western art.
Maybe that's a good segue into the question I might ask.
Oh, yeah, if I could add something to that, what you mentioned about so much of her work already being in private collections. It was a really interesting situation because there, of course, wasn't much of her work on the market. It was quite rare. And when it did, it was quite expensive because the people who owned it didn't want to give it up, which is quite understandable. And consequently, people who might have had a level of interest in it could not necessarily afford to buy it either. So it was this stasis, where things were frozen, essentially. She was popular, but there was no market and no product, if you will.
Yeah.
And she was such a force of nature of herself that had she been willing to make an arrangement with the gallery to heavily promote her, something might have continued after that. But it was her own fierce independence and will that made her so successful in her lifetime that kind of betrayed her legacy for a long period of time afterwards.
Yeah. And it might be said, too, that when she died, she had a 3-year-old son and an 18-year-old son. So neither of them, of course, were empowered to do anything about their mother's legacy. No one else in the family had any ideas that she was well known. Her family, she was raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and they had migrated to Virginia and Connecticut, and they were out east. They treasured the work they had by her, but they had no sense of sharing it with museums or with galleries or creating a market for it at all.
And I might observe, too, that Mac's husbands did not deeply care about her. And that, I think, is a factor. They didn't recognize how deeply she needed to work and put her needs before them. That's a lot of women do this. But.
Okay. We'll come back to obviously raises the question of how it is that a significant number of her paintings did, decades later, end up in a particular museum. But maybe before we get that, either Betsy or Mark, from your perspective, what is so significant about this rediscovery at this moment in time? Does Mac Schweitzer still matter? Why does she matter? What excites you about what Anne's been able to do?
Where do I start? First, Anne cared a lot about this project, and she really kept going on it once she decided this was what crazy thing she was going to do, like her. So I think that made a great deal of difference.
And I think also once Anne started on this, all of us who either knew Mac or had works by her were so excited about being able to share it. You know, her work is people. When you have beautiful work, you want to share it with people. You want other people to see what you see in it, and that kind of uncork the genie out of the bottle.
Well, so Mark, you and your family members are some of the key lenders of works not only in the exhibition, but also works that are featured in Anne's book. So how is it? Is it just that you kept it all in the family? You were one of those greedy people who didn't want anyone to see Mac Schweitzer? Maybe a little bit about how your collection, did you add to it over the years? And then, why don't we start with that?
My dad was a big admirer of her work. They even collaborated on a few projects like the mural at the YMCA, and you know, in that community, artists were supporting one another. If someone had a show, everybody else showed up for it. So there was a really great support network in terms of embracing the work that was being produced by any given artist at the time. And there was a flow back and forth because you could see with some of the artists clear influence from another artist. And in the case of my dad and Mac, they were soaking all of this up. And, you know, it's hard to tell if some of my dad's work that reminds me of Mac's or Mac's that reminds me of my dad's work, where they got it from, or did they get it from each other. There was just this wonderful artistic ferment going on. Nobody was precious about it. It's like, hey, you're copying me. That wasn't going on. It's like, hey, I like where you're taking that. I like where you're going with it. My dad was a big admirer of her work. He was very eclectic in the styles that he did. He was always experimenting with wood block, cement block, linoleum block, watercolors, pencils, you name it. And you can see that in Mac's work. You know, there's really not a media that she didn't explore, at least briefly, but usually fairly extensively. So my dad would acquire works of hers that caught his attention. You know, the first painting that I kind of owned was a
Kind of
painting
owned?
rabbit. And you know, my dad bought it for me. My brother was interested in horses. He bought a couple of horse paintings from him. That was the excuse. So these are Kurt's, and this is for Tommy, and this is for Peg, his wife. You know, so you know, that was the.
I don't need to remind you, but the rabbit is in the gallery.
Yes.
So you can see Mark's rabbit in the gallery.
Empty space over my bedroom right now. So the you know, it was collected because he loved it, admired the work, and I'm sure there were other artists who were also collecting and owning Mac's work. But my dad was in a position to and inclination to acquire whatever the work that caught his attention, and a lot of it caught his attention.
That's really sort of interesting. You know, we often think of the art world as being kind of cutthroat, individualistic painters out there, solitary work. And so the environment you're describing, the kind of intellectual ferment, it's really interesting. But even within that perspective, I wonder, you know, from your perspective, what is it that Mac did that distinguished her from this kind of collaborative milieu? What did she do that separated herself in your eyes?
Well, two things. And one, speaking to the issue of collaboration being cutthroat, think about the West as there's room for everybody. And the artists of the era occupied that space. He didn't bump into somebody else. There was room for innovation and collaboration and support. But what Mac brought was this incredible energy this inner drive to experiment. I won't say innovate, because experiment. Innovation comes from experimentation, but hers was like, oh, okay, that's cool with an ink pen, different nib, but what if I do it with a matchstick? How's that going to work?
And then spray water on it.
Right.
What happens then?
And my dad ran across a model paper from Mexico, and so not everybody, but a number of people, including Mac, were like, okay, let's see what the paint's like if I apply it to the surface. Japanese rice paper got very popular in the 50s, and so Mac and my dad and others were experimenting with, all right, how does it take ink? How does it take watercolor? What can I do to the watercolor to make it take differently? There's an energy of experimentation and an excitement and really a joy to that really fueled her work. And you've seen the work over there, and every piece of art is a celebration.
I'll break in and add one more thing too, and you're alluding to it, but it has a very different twist to me. Mac, from the time she was in high school, was a very close observer. Later she's experimenting, she's doing other things with the media, but the start of it is watching her fellow students and her family members and doing these amazing caricatures of them. Mm-hmm. She has an ability with line to convey that, and I think Tom Bahti did also. So she goes from that to being horse crazy and observing horses very closely and observing the Cleveland Museum of Art and the classic painters who were rendering horses at that time, or in earlier times, but in the museum collections. And then she goes to the Arizona desert and is this long, close observer of what's going on in her very own backyard. Huge impact on her art just by being that watcher.
Yeah, I agree that there's, don't think it's in the exhibit, the hawk that came out of the firewood bin. And a little box full, a little but good sized box for firewood, and was reaching in to grab for a piece of wood to throw on the fire. She looked at it and saw a hawk, and all she added to was 3 bands to make it a Harris hawk.
Yeah.
It was done. So you're right. Her eye was constantly on the move.
She took a cow pelvis, and unlike Georgia O'Keeffe, who kept that cow pelvis on her counter, Mac added 3 copper talons to it and made a pouncing owl.
Betsy, listening to Anne here, it occurs to me that, you tell me what you think of this, perhaps a difference between Mac and some of the earlier women artists in the Southwest is that those women had art training, art backgrounds, came out here and were inspired by the landscape, the people, the paint. But Mac's story is more like the story of Charlie Russell, where she's not in the West, but she's inspired by the popular culture, the iconography, and then is kind of motivated to come West. But she's already making Western art before she gets out here. Is that a fair?
I don't know if she's making art before she got there, but the early women really had a lot to do, and that's partly why the next layer is so important. They weren't like Santa Fe and Taos, which had infrastructure. They had nothing to start with, so they were very, as I said, they really wanted to come, and they loved being in the West.
Can I ask a question too?
Of course.
I had not thought of this, and I haven't looked at the Elliott collection from this standpoint, but how many of those women who preceded Mac, say the first half of the 20th century, maybe a little bit of the 19th, were actually in Tucson versus other places?
Most of them, they're actually in multiple places. Kate Corey is in, one place.
In the north.
In the
but
north.
How many in Tucson? Were there that many of them in Tucson itself?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That has not occurred to me before. Yeah. Yeah, she didn't have their company. I knew that she had not known any of them well, but it just didn't occur to me. The Tucson Arts Colony is largely male, except for Mac. And she just says, okay, I'm colorblind, genderblind, I don't care. I'm playing with these guys. This is what I want to be doing. There were a few other women, and Lila McAfee, maybe, is that the name?
I think so.
Yeah, I'd have to look them up myself. But she was pretty unique in that way.
Again, it almost strikes me as a more archetypally masculine story.
We're just remembering two people that are well worth mentioning, and that would be Berta Wright, very much a part of Tucson, and also Rose Cabot. Mac's first husband worked with Ernie Cabot, and they knew Rose quite well, the wonderful potter from Tucson. So there were a few people, but not in the same ilk, not doing the same things.
No, I mean, one of the most striking moments in your book is where you quote, I'm going to forget the name of the critic, but it's a Tucson art critic, I think 1954, who describes Mac Schweitzer as the feminist response to Charlie Russell. A very provocative statement, but that connects her to a different lineage than the kind of the women's history we have here in the Southwest. So there's something there. So a question to Anne then. Did Mac Schweitzer, so she was driven to paint. Did she want to be a famous artist? Did she aspire to fame? Well, why did she paint?
Yeah, why did she make art?
Yeah.
That's a good question. And we can never jump into someone else's mind, you know, we just can't know that. But from her actions and from her writings and things of that sort, you know, I judge, I've used the word ambition already this evening. She was very ambitious, but she was ambitious for freedom. She was ambitious for adventure, for time away from the heat of Tucson to explore the North Country, the time to sit and closely observe in her own backyard. Those were the goals, not just the means to an end. She wanted to be doing those things. She was a woman of process. I used to say that about Kit Schweitzer all the time. He was a man of process. He always said he wanted to make one of everything. Well, Mac practically did before him. So I don't think it was about fame. You know, she would enter competitions. She wanted to be the equal of other artists, and she wanted to be recognized. She was very proud of judging with Peter Hurd at the Arizona State Fair. And she did wonderful line sketches of the man. So the artist painting the artist there. She was very proud of her connections and being acknowledged, but it wasn't about larger fame, and certainly it wasn't wealth. There is a bit in the book I talk about how her friends complain that she wasn't charging enough. And she herself says, you know, I want to make sure that my paintings have the right home. I don't care about selling them to just anybody. They have to go to the right people. So she had that other than economic and other than fame orientation.
Yeah, I think at the core of it, she could not make art. And in order to continue doing that, she needed to be in the shows and sell her work and so forth. But at the core of it, she had to create.
Feeding her addiction.
Am I right in seeing a kind of egalitarian impulse too? So not only driven to create art, but to create art in so many different modes that it was something that ordinary people could aspire to have. From postcards to wood blocks to more expensive things. Is that a fair interpretation? That she felt like she wanted her art to be accessible to people?
I think so, because she did, in addition to silk screens with Bob Spray, the bulls, the raccoon, the fox, but also the calico sets. Then she did offset prints, little small images of Hopi and Navajo life. So she was definitely trying to make it accessible. And I don't think it was about, I need to have something at a lower price point. I think it was making it accessible to a wider audience.
And she did the most wonderful animals.
They're compelling.
They're very compelling.
Yeah, they're endearing. And I've talked with the docents who are talking to other people about Mac, about that compelling nature. She did know what would sell. she was not naive about that at all, and she knew those would sell. She, with the offset lithographs that are all in blue frames in the gallery, they look like pencil drawings, but in fact they were made in multiples. She didn't number them. She signed them on the metal or the stone on which she was working, but they're not numbered, they're not precious. They were meant to move into people's hands.
And doing those pieces, you know, as you say, for the animals that were obviously going to sell well, then also gave her the freedom to occasionally do really powerful images that people weren't going to hang on their walls. I have one of those, and it's a figure of a man in the grass, and after a minute you realize he's dead, and then you look again, and there's a buzzard, and his wings are outspread and covering much of the body. It's a really intense piece, beautifully executed, but people aren't going to hang that on their bedroom wall.
She entered the painting for that piece in the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts competition, and it took an award. So Mark has the original maquette drawing of that, and the painting is in the gallery here. Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good moment to ask Betsy another question. So you were the chair of our collections committee here.
I was indeed.
For a long time.
A long time.
Chair, and under your leadership as chair, we acquired not only the Fran and Elliott collection, but we also acquired Mac Schweitzer's collection, donated to us, and as well as her archives.
Right, right.
So maybe, could you tell people a bit about what's involved in trying to get a museum like ours to acquire these types of collections? How do you identify the collections? And then, was it an easy sell? Was it a hard sell?
It was an easy sell. I didn't let them say no. Because I really wanted this to be part of that collection. And I think we have a potential of having so many women in the collection. That's going to be, I think, a major thing even now. And there was another collector who what was there? There was another one that we have. We have three things on that. Anne has the best, the most rather, not the best.
The largest.
The largest, but it really is a very big collection.
So let's double back here then. So, Anne, how did you acquire your collection? Were these things that the kid had simply held on to? Did you acquire more things? Did you steal things from Mark when you were over at his house? How is it that how do you go about building a collection of an artist whose work, as we've said, is so widely distributed, it's almost diffuse in a way? How do you get enough to donate something so substantial to a museum like ours?
You've named many ways, and it is one of those sort of following one's nose and a complex process. But I was already a lifelong curator. I'd already been collecting for museums, and I had been on the other side of things. I had been the museum that said, no, I'm sorry, your collection is too large for us to store, we can't care for it, we can't take it. Or no, I'm sorry, your artist is wonderful, but it doesn't fit our scope and collecting mission.
How tactful.
So yes. So I was always on the other side of things. It never happened that I was in charge of a collection to give away. When Kit and I first met, he had a handful of things. When his stepfather died, we inherited a much larger group of things. There were people in Tucson who donated several pieces to the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy came to us and said, would you like to buy these to benefit the Nature Conservancy? And we said, and how, even though we'd never bought before and we were struggling young people at that time. Mac's brother and sister, as I mentioned, had pieces in Connecticut and Virginia, and when they died, we acquired their work through the family as well. So it was a slow accretion in many ways, and as I've told it, neither Kit nor I really had a goal in mind at that time. It was protecting work, but it wasn't a goal of writing about it or publishing or sharing it into the future at that point.
I wonder if, maybe to end before we open it up to questions from the audience, if you would each maybe, I'm not going to hold you to this, maybe talk about one or two of your favorite pieces, either of the show or just pieces in general, and maybe a little bit about why those particular pieces speak to you.
Whatever's on the screen at the moment.
I would agree with that.
Do you want to answer though?
No, that's...
Yeah. I have three favorites, and they're all oils, and they're all somewhat the same styling. And many people have agreed with me when they've asked me that question in the gallery itself. They are the coyote, the horseless carriages, and the corn mother. And those are the pieces that we had always over the sideboard, over the sofa, and over the dining table. So I lived with those very closely and watched them. And so they're favorites in that way. But the story goes a different way, too. I have several pieces in the gallery now that are still mine, that I did not give to the museum, and I chose to keep. And for instance, the two of Navajo shepherds. There's one, a woman with some color in it, and she's with the sheep and goats. And then there's a man in a funny hat with a herd of sheep as well. And both of those are still mine. I love those dearly. I love Mac's line. But I also knew that those were not major works that needed to come to the museum. Those are works that I can lend to the museum, but that I can keep as mine, but they don't mar her legacy by not joining the major collection. So there are a couple of other works like that. I'd love to ask Mark this question. What are your faves?
Similar to what you said, is whichever one I'm looking at the time, because each one is so distinct, has such a different spirit behind it, that I look at it, and there's one of 3 Navajo young men drinking soda pop called Who Are We Now? And that resonates with me on so many different levels for so many different reasons, starting with being 9 years old and waiting to get to that one trading post that had cold pop instead of warm pop. We knew which ones. So when I look at one, I can get lost in it.
Yeah.
And it brings memories, it creates new ideas. If I could talk briefly about Kit. Kit must have absorbed through osmosis or something, because he was doing very different kinds of ceramic work, and he was working for me part-time at my shop. And Groundhog's Day was coming up. Groundhog's Day is a big deal in my family. Why? Because my dad was in retail. Christmas, Thanksgiving, it's busy, don't really have time to get into it, but Groundhog's Day, A, hasn't been commercialized yet, and B, he had time, so it was a lot of fun. And presidents had to be something to eat or drink, so we didn't have to stress about size or color. And I realized I didn't have a painting of the sacred groundhog. So Kit surprised me one day with this wonderful brown and black drawing of a groundhog, and it said Happy Groundhog's Day, and it was brown watercolor wash with black ink, and his mom could have made it. The style, the line was just uncanny. And so I said, if you do any other paintings, let me know. The next one was a William Sierra sitting on a chair drumming as he would appear in a plaza. I still have that. And later on, another of Navajo women making fry bread. And he wasn't copying his mother's work. This was coming straight from within him, because, he was, barely a teenager when his mom died. And he never, I don't think I ever saw anything that he drew before he started doing that groundhog. He might have, but, and I wasn't aware that Mac had done work in clay, but when I saw the clay work, I thought, is that kids?
Goes both ways.
A little reverse right there.
Yeah.
So it was, you know, I couldn't obviously handle Mac's work because she died when I was 12, 13 years old, but I was handling kids' work, and it was just still that level of treasure and pleasure.
Kit would occasionally say that art was more important than anything to his mom, and that he had to simply go along with that as a small child, and that in order to buy her time to do art, she would set him up with butcher paper on the table and set him up with the matchsticks and crayons and paints, and he would work alongside her. One of the lovely thoughts that you don't see in the gallery at all is that Mac painted to classical music almost always. She had a turntable and kept the records going constantly. And Kit absorbed the music as well as the art-making practice. You get up in the morning and you start making art and you don't quit till you go to sleep. So it really was something very much ingrained in him as a child. He got an MFA in ceramics, which is what Mark was referring to when he said Kit came to the shop having made a lot of ceramics. He was a pot maker back then. Both Mac and Kit had a single ceramics mentor, and that was Maurice Grossman, who had started the ceramics department at U of A, and when Mac became a single mother, so this is 1950 or so, she took a class from Maurice Grossman. And his influence, I think, is seen in the ceramics, too, although it would be fun to ask others who know his work better what that combination was. Maurice was a mentor to Kit until Maurice died. So, yeah, nice connections.
So we'd love to welcome anyone in the audience who has a question for any of our panelists. Raise your hand in front of you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious how much is still out there. I know, any sense, I know that in your book you talk about pieces that were never found, and I don't know how many that amounts to. I know that there are people that you know that have collections, some in the exhibit, but any sense of what's still out there, what we may still see that we've never seen?
That's a great question. I assume everybody could hear that question from where you are also. What is out there? I wish Mac had kept a comprehensive catalog. Instead, we have this box of 200 slides. I've never done the count, but I think I've located maybe just less than half of those 200 in the family collection and other people's collections. And then through time, people have come to me as well. So that's, in the pieces I donated here, we say roughly that there were 500 objects donated in that acquisition. 126 or 128 are paintings, framed paintings. And then there are a couple hundred sketches, other paintings, prints, other materials. And finally, there are several hundred archival objects, whether they're scrapbooks, photo albums, or individual photographs. So we've got 125 documented right here. We've got another 100 or 200 in the slide collection. And my best guess, coming down to the final auction amount, is that Mac probably did between 500 and 600 paintings in her lifetime. And that lifetime, just over a decade of career making painting. She was a busy woman in that period.
So what's your next project? Do you have something in mind?
Well, this year is celebrating this collection, and really sharing it with people and making sure that the word is out. I'm toying on a couple of other writing projects. As we all know, we're not retired.
Right.
There are always, projects going on. Yeah.
Other questions for our panelists?
I'm more curious about the box of slides. Like, how did that come to be? Where did it show up?
You know, as I was telling that story this evening, I was realizing I can probably date it. I believe it came from Kit's stepfather, Art White, Mac's second husband, as did many paintings and many sketchbooks and photo albums and all of that. He had kept those for the 60 years. And I'm pretty sure he had that rusty box of slides.
Well, maybe I'll ask the question that, and you and I have talked about, because we know that somebody always asks it, maybe not in front of everyone, but I'll ask it. So earlier you enumerated different reasons why Mac fell out of the public view in 1962. There's potentially a fifth one, and that's the specter of suicide and the stigma that goes along with that. Yes. So I'll say it. So the official cause of death for Mac Schweitzer is that she took her own life in 1962. Someone always asks you about this when we do tours. So what are we to make of that? Did that substantially influence how people saw her? Did the stigma of suicide contribute to the very quick forgetting of Mac Schweitzer?
We can discuss that at the outset, and I haven't tried explaining it this way before, but I will try, by leaving Mac out of it. We know that depression is something that is very endemic among artists in time and in many cultures. So the specter, as you framed it, of suicide can go one of two ways, really. It could go a spectrum of ways, but it can make someone more famous. Van Gogh and his tragedy. It can make them an entire reputation and a legacy. It can also deep six them. So we can't determine that. It's indeterminate. There was some surprise in the audience, and I apologize for that. In the exhibition and in the book, we talk about the fact that the newspapers recorded in 1962 that Mac had likely died by suicide. And yet, there are many presentations I give where I don't raise that issue particularly. What happened to me in the process of doing the research was to recognize that this woman was far more than any end of life, no matter how her life ended. The point was her work, her life, her sons, everything else going on. And originally, I think this is why Kit and I wanted a short book, just images and captions. He did not want to go into this. We lived with the thought that yes, she had likely taken her own life. It was a long time ago. It was a very remote place. There was no major investigation, but the newspapers had reported it, and everybody in Tucson, Phoenix, Scottsdale, Flagstaff knew about it. If you mention a woman who lived at Navajo National Monument in the 50s, most people who had been there or close to there would nod and say, oh yes, the woman who killed herself. This was the specter that existed. So I assumed that's what I would be dealing with, and had thought that I likely would be writing a book and learning a lot about depression and about mental illness and about women in the 1950s and the plights that they had. And instead, I began to see this woman in her own words and in her own works and in other people's eyes, the reviewers that were writing. And 2 years into the research and writing, I happened on a stack of letters between Mac and a couple in Wyoming that neither Kit nor I, nor anyone really, knew about. It was a happenstance that I even found them. It was through Janet Burlow, of all things, through an art historical colleague of ours. And those letters Mac writes between 58 and 62 when she died in such a vital and such a resistant and such an assertive way. It's clear she is frustrated. It's clear, as you've alluded to, that art was the most important thing. She couldn't not do art. And when she found herself in a new marriage, a rather abrupt marriage, and with a new baby, but she did not get married because she was pregnant. It happened 1.5 years later. I worked in my way into that one, didn't I? But in any case, she found herself in a rough spot, and she wrote about it. And all of a sudden I realized this woman wasn't writing to an end in terms of taking her own life. She was working to resist all of that. And I have to say that as a researcher, not as a family member, but as a researcher, I am no longer comfortable accepting the notion that she did absolutely take her own life. As I said, it was a long time ago, it was a remote place, there were no investigations. I will not speculate about what happened. But I just want you to know how amazing and talented and brilliant this woman was during her life.
I remember, excuse me, when my dad got the call, and he was absolutely shocked. And for him, what that meant was the art ended, and that was a tragedy.
Yeah, yeah. I have to say that there were many, many people who were absolutely shocked and in disbelief when it was announced that Mac was gone. Now that can happen with any unexpected death. That can happen with a suicide or with any number of things, and it's no proof of either side of that argument. But people were shocked. They were in disbelief. They were in grief. She was a precious person to particularly the Tucson community. What happened next is the curious part that kind of comes back to Andrew's question of her legacy, and that is that people began to retrospectively look at her work backwards and say, oh yeah, there's a dark mood there. She must have been depressed. There's a distressed woman. She's bound to commit suicide. People work that retrospectively. And if you go through the gallery, you could do that. You know, 2 years before I found those letters, I could do that. Kit never knew. One of my strongest wishes is that my husband could have known that we have now suspicions about his mother's end of life. He never suspected it. We didn't. True of many of the family members that are gone now. So then comes the legacy question, because as I've grappled with this, and Betsy, you're a good one for this too, I have not perceived that there were actual reactions from galleries about this being a suicide and saying, oh no, we can't handle her work anymore. Oh no, that's too hot to handle. That's too sad a story. That's too serious a subject. I don't think so. You know, it's just simply that there wasn't work out there. The market wasn't there. And Mac and her family members were no longer available to make the legacy visible. I don't know about other artists whose ends have enhanced or abated their careers.
None that I have worked on. And my early artists all lived long, long lives.
Yeah.
In my field, you know, any number of artists have been in it for 52 years, so there have been some passings.
Yeah.
And people say, well, you know, so-and-so just died, is the work more valuable now? And I don't recall anybody ever asking my dad or anyone else, is Mac's work going to go up in value? Because it wasn't, acquiring her work wasn't about that. It was acquiring it because he loved the work. And they were, as evidenced by how many of these pieces are still in the hands, or were in the hands of the original people. Nobody had any intention of selling her work.
Yeah.
They were keeping it.
Yeah. And I think there are many pieces still in family collections that way, absolutely.
I would just reiterate that I think one of my favorite aspects of the exhibition is in that final section, which you titled Life and Death. And it's a brave thing where you challenge the visitor of the gallery on the idea that we can straightforwardly read art biographically, as if art wouldn't reflect the complexity of a life, because we all recognize lives are complex. So to me, that's one of the boldest and best things that the gallery does. We really do put people on the spot and say, it's too easy to read it that way. Look back and appreciate this artist and in all of the nuance that we see. I know we had a hand over here.
Yes, this may be a totally crazy question, but I love the title of the exhibit a maverick, and because she was born immediately after the amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote after they fought for it for 100 years, I'm wondering about her mother and what the impact of that major transition for women in America may have had on Mac to have enabled her to be a maverick rather than to fit into some standard 1920s picture of a female.
So she's asking about Mac's mother as a possible influence in being an independent woman at that moment of women's emancipation. I wish I knew more. I don't know for certain. I do. Well, no, I'd go with it too. I would. I spent time looking through the Cox family genealogies and gathering stories from remaining Cox relatives, as well as Schweitzer relatives. That's not Mac's bloodline, but it's her first husband's family and Kit's family. And there were many strong women in those families, that is true. Mac's parents were Catholic. Her mother came from Canada to Bermuda as a piano player for the silent movies in Bermuda. Her father came from the UK as a journeyman printer to Bermuda to be a printer, but turned out to love the movies better and worked in the movie theater, the silent movie theater. So they met there. They moved then to Ohio, where they had other family members and raised their family in Cleveland. There's a huge contrast between Mac and her sister, Barb. They were both absolutely horse crazy. Mac is the older, and then there's Barb, and then there's Buster or John, the younger brother. And Mac and Barb were horse crazy, but Barb turned out to raise Arabian horses, marry a school principal, and have a Connecticut farm with white fences. Mac moved west. The brother was always joked. I knew Mac's sister, and she would joke about, and I knew the brother. He was wonderful. She joked that he was a wimp, just like his British father. He became an architect and a collector of sailboats and women on both coasts. He was wonderful. Actually, same woman, but both coasts. How did I used to tell that story? He had a sailboat on both coasts and a woman in common for both. So he was a wonderful man. So they were, a middle-class Cleveland, Middle West family in many ways, but there were strong women, and you may have something there. I don't know. I hope that answered it too.
Well, on that note, please join me in another round of applause for our